The bolt pattern was wrong. Not by much. Maybe 2 millimeters off on the anchor spacing. But I'd been doing structural ironwork for 14 years, and 2 millimeters on a load-bearing connection at the 43rd floor of a building that was supposed to open in 11 days. That's not a rounding error. That's a funeral waiting to happen. I remember crouching down on the cold concrete of the mechanical floor, holding my flashlight at an angle the way you do when you want the shadows to tell you the truth. The shadows told me the truth. My name is Tanner Cole. I'm 39 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with my daughter Rosie. She was 7 at the time this happened, and a cat named Bucket that Rosie named when she was 4, and I didn't have the heart to correct. I've been doing ironwork since I was 24, straight out of a 2-year apprenticeship with Local 15. My ex-wife left when Rosie was 18 months old, said she hadn't signed up for a life that smelled like steel and rust and damp work gloves. Maybe she was right, I don't know. What I do know is that I was good at my job, I paid my bills on time, I coached Rosie's soccer team on Saturdays, and I had never, not once in 14 years, signed my name to something I knew was wrong. That was about to cost me everything. The Harwick Tower project had been running for 18 months by the time I transferred onto the crew. It was a prestige job, 47 stories of mixed commercial and residential in downtown New Haven, the kind of project that gets written up in trade magazines and has its own Instagram account. The kind of project where people from the development side show up on site in heels and tailored coats and say things like the vision without blinking. I'd heard the name Cecilia Harwick before I ever met her. You don't work in Connecticut construction without hearing that name. Her family had been developing real estate in the Northeast for 3 generations. Old money that had learned how to make new money, which is the most dangerous kind. The Harwick Group owned something like 40 commercial properties between New Haven and Boston, plus a handful of residential towers and a resort property up in Vermont. Cecilia had taken over the company 11 years ago when her father had a stroke, and by every account I'd ever heard, she ran it harder than he ever had. The first time I saw her on site was a Tuesday morning in early March. She came through the mechanical floor with 2 men in suits and the site project manager, a guy named Dennis, who sweated through his collar every time she asked a question. She was maybe 50, sharp-faced, dark hair pulled back, wearing a coat that probably cost more than my truck. She walked the floor like she owned it, which of course she did. She didn't look at me. I was just a guy with a flashlight crouching next to a connection plate. That's what I was. That's all any of us were to her. I went back to work and didn't think about it again. 3 days later, I found the bolt pattern. I want to explain what I mean because I don't want this to sound abstract. The 43rd floor had a cantilevered section, a part of the building that extends out past the main structural footprint. It was designed to hold a sky lounge, the kind of glass and steel observation space that looks beautiful in renderings and takes extremely precise engineering to build safely. The load transfer on a cantilever like that depends entirely on the anchor connections, where the cantilevered steel meets the primary frame. If those anchors are off, the force doesn't go where it's supposed to go. It goes somewhere else. And somewhere else, in structural engineering, means into places that aren't built to handle it. The spacing I found was 2.3 millimeters off on 6 of the 12 connection points. Now, I want to be honest with you. I'm a journeyman ironworker, not a structural engineer. I can read a drawing. I can measure a bolt pattern. I cannot tell you with certainty what the failure load would be on a connection that's 2.3 millimeters off spec. What I can tell you is that the specification exists for a reason, and deviating from it without a signed engineering change order is not something that gets waved away. I documented everything. Photographs, measurements, the drawing reference numbers. Then I brought it to my foreman, a guy named Pete Salazar, who I'd worked with on 2 previous jobs and trusted completely. Pete looked at my photos, he looked at the measurements, he was quiet for a long time. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He exhaled through his nose. "Tanner, do you know how close we are to the punch list?" "I know exactly how close we are." He looked at me again, and I could see something complicated moving behind his eyes. Not dishonesty. More like a man watching 2 trains headed toward each other and trying to figure out which one he's on. "I'll bring it up the chain," he said. He brought it up the chain. The chain brought it back down 2 days later with a note from the structural engineer of record, a man named Gordon Fitch, whose company had been doing work for the Harwick Group for 9 years, that said the deviation fell within acceptable construction tolerance. I read that note 3 times. Then I pulled the project specification, Section 05-1200 structural steel, and I read the tolerance table. The allowable deviation for anchor bolt placement on a cantilevered connection of that type was plus or minus 1.5 millimeters. 2.3 is not within 1.5. I said as much to Pete. Pete said he believed me, but his hands were tied. I said then someone else's hands needed to be untied. He looked at the floor for a while. Then he said, "You might want to think about what you're doing here, Tanner. This is a Harwick job." I thought about it. I thought about it for about 4 seconds. "I'm going to put it in writing," I said. I filed a formal written notice of potential nonconformance with the general contractor's quality control office. That was on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, I had been asked to meet with the project manager, Dennis, and a man I hadn't seen before, named Aldrich Stern, who introduced himself as the Harwick Group's vice president of construction operations. We sat in a trailer that smelled like printer ink and stale coffee. Aldrich Stern was somewhere in his late 50s, gray-haired, very still in the way that certain powerful men are still. Like stillness is a form of authority. He told me that Gordon Fitch's assessment had been reviewed internally and confirmed. He told me that the project was 11 days from certificate of occupancy. He told me that the Harwick Tower opening had been covered by 3 regional newspapers and was expected to bring significant economic development to the area. He told me all of this in the tone of someone reading facts into a record. Then he leaned back and looked at me. "Mr. Cole," he said, "the Harwick Group values workers who raise legitimate concerns. We take safety seriously. But we also need to be confident that our workforce understands the difference between a genuine structural issue and an overreach of their technical authority." I kept my face neutral. I'd been on enough job sites to know when someone is telling you to know your place without saying it directly. "I understand my technical authority fine," I said. "I know how to read a specification." He nodded slowly. "Gordon Fitch has been a licensed structural engineer for 31 years, and the specification says 1.5 millimeters, I said. I measured 2.3. The math is the same regardless of who does it. The meeting ended shortly after that. On Monday morning, I got to the site and my access badge didn't work. Pete called me at 9:30 to tell me I'd been reassigned off the project due to schedule optimization. He sounded like he was reading from a script, and he probably was. I asked him if he was serious. He said he was sorry, Tanner. I said I knew he was. I drove home. Rosie was at school. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and thought about what 14 years of doing things right had gotten me. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make this sound simpler than it was. I had a daughter in 2nd grade and a rent payment due in 3 weeks, and a truck with 140,000 miles on it. I had about $6,000 in savings. The job market for ironworkers in Connecticut in March is not exactly a seller's market. I understood every practical reason why a man in my situation might decide that he had said his piece, filed his paperwork, and now it was time to let it go. I understood those reasons. I just couldn't make them stick. I hired a licensed structural engineer named Catherine Doss to do an independent review. It cost me $2,200, which was more than a third of my savings. She asked me to describe the measurements and send her my photographs and the relevant specification pages. She came back to me in 4 days. Her assessment was that the deviations I had documented were, in her professional opinion, outside allowable tolerance, and that she would not be comfortable certifying the connections as built without a formal engineering change order supported by a revised load analysis. I asked her if she would put that in writing. She said she would, and she did. I sent Catherine Doss's report to the Connecticut Department of Labor's Division of Occupational Safety. I sent a copy to the New Haven Building Department. I sent a copy to the project's general contractor, addressed to their legal department. Then I waited. That's when Cecilia Harwick called me herself. I didn't know it was her at first. I picked up a number I didn't recognize on a Wednesday afternoon while I was standing in the parking lot of Rosie's school, waiting to pick her up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost conversational, like we were continuing a discussion we'd started somewhere else. "Mr. Cole," she said, This is Cecilia Harwick. I'd like to speak with you directly if you're willing. I looked around the parking lot. A few other parents were clustered near the door. Someone's kid was chasing pigeons. I'm listening, I said. I appreciate that. A pause. I want you to know that I've personally reviewed the documentation you submitted. I've also spoken with Gordon Fitch at length. Okay. I believe there may have been a miscommunication about how the tolerance issue was being characterized, she said. That's something I'd like to address, but I'd also like to speak with you about the manner in which you chose to escalate this situation. Something in my chest went tight. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. The manner, I said. You went to regulatory agencies before you had exhausted internal resolution processes, she said. That created a significant problem for us. We have a timeline, we have investors, we have commitments to the city of New Haven, and because of the way this was handled, we're now looking at an external audit that could delay occupancy by 6 to 8 weeks. I did raise it internally, I said. I raised it with my foreman. I raised it in writing with the GC's Quality Control Office. I was then removed from the project. Silence. I understand this situation may have been mishandled on our end, she said, and I could tell that sentence cost her something. I'd like to meet with you, in person. I think there are things worth discussing. I thought about Rosie coming through that school door in about 4 minutes. I thought about $3,800 in savings and a February electric bill I hadn't opened yet. I'll meet with you, I said. We met 2 days later at the Harwick Group's offices in downtown New Haven, 15th floor, corner conference room, a view of the harbor that probably took someone's breath away on good days. Cecilia Harwick was different in person than she'd been moving through a job site. Smaller, somehow, though not in any way that seemed like weakness. More contained. She shook my hand and looked me in the eye and gestured to a chair. And there was something in the way she did it, like she'd done 1,000 meetings but was trying to do this one differently, that made me slightly less certain about what was coming. There was no one else in the room. That surprised me. She set a folder on the table between us but didn't open it. I'm going to be direct with you, she said. I'd appreciate that. The external audit has confirmed what your independent engineer found, she said. The connections are outside tolerance. We're going to need to remediate before occupancy. I sat with that for a second. I'd known I was right. Knowing you're right and hearing someone tell you you're right are different things. How many connections? I said. 6 of the 12, as you documented. The load analysis indicates the risk of catastrophic failure was low but non-zero under projected occupancy loads. Non-zero. That's engineering language for people could have died. She looked at me steadily. I was told by my team that your concern had been evaluated and found acceptable. I should have looked at it myself. I didn't. That's on me. I didn't say anything. I'd like to discuss restitution, she said, for your lost wages, and for the cost of the independent review you commissioned. That's not why I'm here, I said. I know, she said, but I'd like to do it anyway. She opened the folder. I'd also like to discuss whether you'd be willing to consult with us on quality control protocols going forward. We're restructuring how we handle field-level non-conformance reports, and I'd like someone with your kind of knowledge involved in that process. I looked at her for a long time. I was trying to figure out what she was, exactly, whether this was another angle or whether it was real. Why would you want me involved? I said. I'm the guy who cost you 6 weeks. She looked at the harbor for a moment, then back at me. You're the guy who stopped me from opening a building with a structural defect, she said. That's a different thing. I didn't take the consulting role right away. I went home, picked up Rosie from my neighbor's house, made spaghetti, helped her with a worksheet about the water cycle, and put her to bed. Then I sat on the couch for a long time in the dark. My phone had 4 missed calls from union contacts who'd heard what happened. 2 of them from guys who'd worked Harwick jobs and wanted to compare notes. I didn't call any of them back that night. What I kept thinking about was not the vindication or the money or the consulting offer. What I kept thinking about was a night about 6 years earlier, before Rosie was in school, when I'd carried her around a parking lot at midnight because she had an ear infection and wouldn't stop crying, and I hadn't known what else to do. Just walked laps around the lot until she finally went limp against my shoulder. And I remembered thinking, while I was walking, that this is the whole job. You don't get to stop when it's hard. You don't get to put her down because she's heavy. You just walk. I thought about that a lot in the weeks after the meeting. The idea that there's a version of integrity that isn't noble or dramatic, it's just stubborn. It's just, I measured 2.3 millimeters and the specification says 1.5, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know how subtraction works. I took the consulting role. It was part-time at first. 12 hours a week reviewing non-conformance procedures and helping develop a field reporting protocol that didn't require workers to go 3 levels up the chain before a written concern could be logged. Cecilia Harwick was in 2 of the first 3 meetings. She asked good questions. She didn't talk over people. I revised my first impression of her by about 40%. The lost wages and the cost of Catherine Doss's review were settled through the GC's insurance carrier, which is a long way of saying I got a check. It wasn't a windfall. It covered what I'd lost and a little more. I went back to ironwork on another job that spring. Local 15 had a hospital expansion project starting in Hamden that was budgeted through the following year. I spent my weeks in the iron and my Saturdays coaching soccer and my Wednesday evenings doing consulting calls with the Harwick Group's construction team. It was, in the strange arithmetic of my life, more sustainable than it had any right to be. There is a specific moment I keep coming back to. It was about 8 months after the Harwick Tower remediation was completed. The building had opened by then, 6 weeks late, with a brief mention in a local business column that cited delays related to enhanced safety protocols. I was on the Hamden job, 4th floor of what would eventually be an oncology wing, and I was eating lunch on a steel beam with my back against a column and my hard hat off, face up to the November sun. My phone buzzed. It was an email from Cecilia Harwick, not from her assistant, from her directly. It said, "The Sky Lounge opened yesterday. We had an event up there last night, about 80 people. I stood in the middle of the room and thought about you. I thought you should know." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my jacket pocket and finished my sandwich. I don't know how to explain what I felt exactly. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter than that, like the specific satisfaction of setting a thing down that you've been carrying a long time and finding out your arms still work. Rosie is 10 now. She knows some version of this story, the version that's appropriate for a 10-year-old, which is mostly, "Daddy found a problem at work, Daddy told the truth about it. Some people got mad. Eventually things worked out." She's heard it enough times that she's started to call it the building thing, which I think is exactly the right amount of interest for a 5th grader to have in her father's occupational ethics. A few months ago, she was doing a project for school about someone she admired. I assumed she'd pick a soccer player or a YouTuber or something. She came to me with her notebook and asked me to spell nonconformance. I spelled it for her. She wrote it down very carefully. "Is that really a word?" she said. "It's really a word," I said. She looked at it on the page. "It sounds like a word you made up. It's a word that means something that doesn't match what the rules say it should be." She thought about that for a second. "And you found one?" "I found one," I said. She nodded like that settled something. Then she went back to her project. I stood at the kitchen counter for a while after that, not doing anything in particular, just standing there. The apartment was quiet. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn 2 blocks over, and I could hear Bucket doing something in the hallway that sounded like he was wrestling a paper bag. I thought about the 43rd floor and the flashlight and the 2mm shadow that told me the truth. Some things you can't unknow. I've decided that's not a burden. I've decided it's just the way the job works.